Daniel, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Charlie. Good to be with you. And apologies from me to everybody who's joining as well for the delay. Slight internet connection problems on my end, so apologies for that.
These things are unavoidable sometimes and out of our control. Although we wish internet connections were perfect all the time, we know that just isn't the case.
Indeed.
But glad we got here in the end, and really excited to hear your answers today. I think it's going to be very interesting for our young people to hear a little bit about the charity you work for, particularly because it's, not a English or England-based charity, so it should be really interesting. So for our first question, just so that the young people listening can get to know who you are a little bit better, could you please tell us about your career journey and what it is that you do now?
Sure, yeah. So my kind of story begins with a bit of a sad beginning in a way, because I'm a university dropout. After I left school, I went to the University of St Andrews initially, and I come from a fairly poor part of a city called Dundee in the east of Scotland, and I was the first person in my family to go to university. So a lot of expectation and happiness, really, that I was going to study at the University of St Andrews. But actually, I was so overcome by the sense of pressure and being a bit of a fish out of water there that I lasted maybe only 2 or 3 months, really, before dropping out. I share that just because I think, especially when kids are really focused on their schoolwork and their education, you can feel that sense of pressure, and you can feel that there's a particular path that you must follow in order to be successful. I definitely think that my story is a good example of how things can work out even when there are bumps in the road. After I dropped out of university, I actually was very fortunate in that the publisher in my hometown, a company called DC Thomson, was looking for trainee journalists at that time, and language has always been my kind of big focus, communication in general. I was studying foreign languages at St Andrews. That's what I was planning to do, was become an interpreter. But instead of ending up doing that, I applied for this traineeship in journalism at DC Thomson. They're most famous for the comics, the Beano and the Dandy, but they do have newspapers and magazines, etc. Anyway, I got really lucky and got that traineeship in journalism, and so the first part of my career was being a journalist. I began working on, I don't know if anybody listening will know this, but Shout magazine, the magazine for teenage girls, and that was a good few years. I did that for the first part of my career, but also worked in different magazines, comics, some newspaper work. Anyway, that all led up to a point where I was working for, in the end, a magazine called My Weekly magazine, which is, it's interesting. I started out writing for teenage girls. My Weekly was for older women. So it's two ends of that spectrum of female readers. And at the time I was working for My Weekly, I was doing a lot of celebrity interviews, and I remember, I don't know if anybody will know this person, but Gok Wan, who's a guy who's famous kind of fashionista on the TV. I remember he was the last celebrity interview I did before the interview that really changed my career path, because I interviewed the founder of the charity I now work for, Mary's Meals, a guy called Magnus McFarlane Barrow. I was just writing a piece about his amazing efforts with Mary's Meals. And the reason I remember so deeply that Gok Wan came the day before was that Gok, as fun as he was a bit more kind of frivolous in content versus speaking to Magnus about how he was trying to change the world for hungry and impoverished children. Anyway, I was so inspired by that something like 3 or 4 months later, I was working for Mary's Meals, giving up being a journalist, because I was convinced that this man, Magnus, who's been my boss for 12 years now, was doing such an amazing thing in the world. And it's just one of those moments in life where, again, you just feel fortunate that you were in the right place at the right time, because doing that interview changed my life in a way I really didn't expect when I went into it. So now my role with Mary's Meals is executive director of the UK-based organisation, and so that's about raising money to feed hungry and impoverished children for the most part. Mary's Meals UK is the part of the Mary's Meals family of organisations globally that raises about 50% of the income that makes our work possible. So that's what my day job is.
Awesome. And our next question is to find out a little bit more about Mary's Meals. So could you tell us about, what's the importance of the charity and what impact does it have, both kind of within the UK and maybe thinking globally as well?
Yeah, well, firstly, let me just say what it is. Mary's Meals is a really simple idea that works. We provide the world's poorest children with one good meal every day in their place of education. And by providing that meal in the place of education, we do two things really. We meet the child's need for immediate nutrition by filling their empty tummies. But more than that, we attract them into the classroom where they can receive an all-important education. It's really important to realise that the countries in which Mary's Meals is working, because we're always feeding in the world's poorest places, children are often so poor that instead of going to school, they're forced to work from a young age or even beg, and sometimes in the worst circumstances, forage for food just to survive. So within that context, the last thing on a child's mind is getting into the classroom and getting an education. So really what Mary's Meals is there to do is to remove that barrier, try to incentivize the child to come to school because they will be fed there. And over time, as I say, they gain that all-important education as well. And we just firmly believe that the children who are receiving Mary's Meals today are growing up better nourished and better educated than they would otherwise be, so that they're able to become eventually the men and women who will lift their communities out of poverty and eventually end the reliance on this type of aid. There are 67 million children around the world who are out of school because of poverty, a huge number. There's a further 73 million who are in school, but they're too hungry to learn effectively. They just can't concentrate on their lessons. So that it's really that problem that Mary's Meals is seeking to solve. And we began our work in 2002, so just over 20 years ago now, feeding 200 children in Malawi in Southeast Africa. And today we're feeding very close to 2.5 million children every single school day. So our growth in these 20 some years has been really massive, and as I say, feeding now just short of 2.5 million children every single day, and that's across 18 different countries. Vast majority of our work takes place in sub-Saharan Africa, in places like Malawi, Liberia, Zambia, Kenya, Zimbabwe, but also in parts of the world where there's terrible poverty in slums, places like India and in Haiti, where we feed in one of the most violent slums in the world called Cité Soleil. And also in countries that are affected by conflict and have been war-torn, places like Syria, but also South Sudan, which is always in a state of conflict, a country which has 70% of children who are out of school. Could you imagine that here, if 70% of our children did not go to the classroom every day? And also other war-torn contexts like Yemen and Ethiopia. So it's a lot of different environments that Mary's Meals is feeding in, but what unites them all is that level of malnutrition is high and the number of children out of school is high. And so we are seeking to get in there and change that. And the impact that we have, we study this, and if people want to check out the Mary's Meals website, they can see the studies that we've done, externally verified research, to try to make sure that the impact of Mary's Meals in terms of getting children to enrol into school, getting them to attend frequently, and improving their attainment and their concentration on their studies, that's all something which we see massively improving through our work. So that's it in a nutshell, really. In terms of the UK, here is really where we invite people to raise money for our work and raise awareness of our work. We're not feeding directly here in the UK. There's definitely a need for food provision for people who are vulnerable in the UK, but it's not our particular mission. And the UK would be one of now about 15 or 16 countries worldwide who are raising money for Mary's Meals through their own Mary's Meals organisations. It's a federated charity structure, really, of lots and lots of different countries working together to try and solve this terrible problem.
Thank you for that kind of little bit of in-depth dive on the charity. Really interesting to hear about kind of all the countries, and it must be such a difficult operation to run on such a large scale. I was really shocked at the 2.5 million children a day get fed that meal and encouraged to be in education. That is a huge number, but I imagine it always feels like it's not enough, because there's still so many more that are impacted and in those situations. So proud, and yet so much that you must want to do. It must be really difficult to be like, yes, but they're still going.
Yeah, even though we've grown from 200 children in the beginning to 2.5 million now, we always say that our work is still only just beginning. That's really the key thing. When I kind of, as you've pointed out, Charlie, still so many kids waiting for our meals, and I shared those massive numbers of children who are in difficulty or not in school. So yeah, so much to do, and that's why we go on with this work even after 20 years, still determined to achieve growth.
So thinking about kind of your charity, we have this next question. I think it's a really kind of interesting thing to think about. So what are your most important values as an individual, and how do they align with that charity? Thinking back on you giving up journalism and then going to join the charity, like that sort of value, what made you go, this is what I need to be doing, and how did those align with that charity?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many of my personal values that very happily align with the Mary's Meals organisational values. I mean, the key thing which made me want to make the leap after meeting Magnus and interviewing him, and despite the fact I loved being a journalist, was because I really felt called personally to be doing something every day which was working to support people who were vulnerable, marginalised, disadvantaged. And so I suppose my key value that I feel very deeply is just an empathy for people who find themselves in difficulty. I think that comes from my own upbringing. I actually had a very comfortable upbringing because my parents were tremendously supportive of me and my brothers, but we did come from a very working class, poor part of Dundee, as I said earlier. I had cousins and things who suffered very, very deeply through poverty and drug addiction, and actually drug overdoses and deaths and things like that. So a lot of thing in my immediate family where I think society can be very judgmental of people who find themselves in difficulty or find themselves in degrees of vulnerability. And I just saw from direct experience that so often it was not through individuals' own fault, but because of the circumstances in which kind of society had placed them. So that's kind of my core driving purpose. And so that's something I'd been developing kind of in my own mind for years and reflecting on. And so when the opportunity arose to go and work for an organisation like Mary's Meals, I just kind of leapt at it. What better way to bring that alive than to try and serve everyday children who are living in deep poverty? So that's maybe the kind of central thing. A few other things which maybe just align with Mary's Meals quite well. Just a deep belief in the dignity of every human person, and wanting to uphold that dignity. One of the things that my sector, the international development sector, can be rightly criticised for at times is kind of painting the developing world as a very dark place where nothing good ever happens and it's just dreadful. And you see these images sometimes of flies in children's eyes and just emaciated kids and all the rest of it. And of course, children and communities in general do live in deep difficulty, but that doesn't mean that there isn't joy and happiness in parts of the world where people are living in poverty. In fact, I think it is a real truth that there is a degree of happiness in certain ways which outstrips our material world, in the West particularly, when you visit some of the world's poorest places. But that dignity of the human person through Mary's Meals, we really try to uphold that by trying to stay focused as much as possible on joy and hope, rather than the tragedy of it all, because I think there is lots of reasons to hope. We are kind of servants of hope in our work. So that's definitely a value that the organisation has and I align with. Another one, which is maybe less philosophical and more very, very practical, is good stewardship of resources. Mary's Meal is an organisation which focuses on keeping our costs low. The way that we're able to do that is that those 2.5 million children are fed every day by volunteer cooks. Thousands, tens of thousands of volunteers, often parents of the children, who get up early, walk many miles to the local school, collect water, collect firewood, cook the meals and serve it to the children. And it's because they're doing it for nothing, for the love of it, for the good of their children, that we're able to do it so cost efficiently. And today we're able to feed a child for a whole year for just £19.15. So less than £20 can feed a child for a whole school year. So that cost efficiency brought about by that volunteer spirit is a key part of how we go about our work. And maybe just the last thing I'll mention is a value I love about Mary's Meals is that we talk about believing in the innate goodness of people. I think there's so much, a bit like that thing I was saying about focusing on the negatives rather than the joy and hope. There can be a lot of cynicism in the world. There can be a lot of believing that people are kind of motivated by self-interest for the most part. Well, actually, our experience is that when you tell people about children living in poverty and you tell them that it costs less than £20 to feed them for a whole year, people generally respond, and they respond generously. And so just that kind of deep belief in the innate goodness of people is a key part of what makes Mary's Meals tick. And it's something that I like to try and keep at the forefront of my mind when I'm meeting people every day. Don't be cynical about people's intentions. Of course, people can be selfish, I can be selfish, but a lot of the time people are selfless. And when asked to support people who are vulnerable, then they'll do it. We talk about Mary's Meals being the sum of lots of little acts of love. Basically, everybody who gets involved in our mission, each person individually, it might not be the most, game-changing, groundbreaking thing on its own, but it's when you bring together all these little acts of love that they become massively meaningful. And there can't be a greater kind of sign of how meaningful it is that it is making sure 2.5 million children receive a nutritious daily meal in school every day. So those are some of the values that we have and which I love about Mary's Meals.
I think that's really interesting, both, talking about the empathy and kind of keeping in mind, and also touching on that, you said about the selfishness, and I even think to a degree that it's okay, if helping other people brings you happiness and you're helping others and doing that, some may say that's selfish because you're doing it because it brings you joy, but in that level of empathy, does it even matter, that's what you're doing, that's the impact you're having, and if you get joy from that and if that aligns with your values, then that's only a good thing, surely. Definitely not the worst thing to have that moment of selfishness about, I guess.
Absolutely. No, and it's about the common good, isn't it? If you're delivering some charitable initiative and it makes you really happy, but it also makes the end beneficiary happy and supported and in a better place, then everybody wins. There's nothing wrong with that at all. There's a supporter of Mary's Meals who I remember years ago said that we sell joy. That's kind of the business that we're in. And he was saying that because he was meaning not to the hungry child, but also to people who choose to get involved and to support, that you are buying into a degree of joy through the whole thing. So yeah, if somebody wants to call that selfish, that's a good kind of selfishness, because in the end it results in a selfless support for vulnerable children.
Yeah, certainly. It's a really, really interesting question. I'm really glad that you answered that one. It was really great to hear kind of your responses. So our next question is, what's the difference between working for a normal corporate company, everyday company, and a not-for-profit company?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, this one. I think when people are asked this, especially folk in the charity sector, because I've heard other people asked it before, there is a tendency, I think, sometimes to come up with quite unhelpful generalizations. Because on one hand, sometimes you hear people talk about charities as being run on a shoestring, not having the same degree of kind of processes and procedures as a corporate organization, being less slick and therefore a bit less professional. So that's something you might hear somebody say about the charity sector. Um, on the flip side, you might hear people paint corporate organizations as kind of unfeeling, sort of purely driven by profit organisations who treat their employees badly. And the reality is that across the charity and corporate sectors, and indeed the public sector as well, there are really good organisations and there are organisations which are less good. So I think it's important to realise that actually you can have extremely professional, well-run charities against that stereotype I just mentioned, and you can also have really empathetic, values-based corporates against that other stereotype that I mentioned that sometimes can come out. So I definitely think it depends on the organisation. I think the bottom line in terms of the difference between the two sectors is that obviously a corporate organisation exists for shareholder value for the most part. So whether that's an individual business owner or a group of shareholders, the business in the end is delivering its products or its services in order to make sure that it delivers value for those people who own the organisation. And a nice byproduct of all of that might be that the staff are well remunerated and they have a good job. And also maybe even the product or the service has some sort of public good, even though it is for profit. But the difference in the charity sector, of course, is that the shareholders are really the end users, the end beneficiaries. So instead of a kind of boardroom of people who want to know what their investment is getting in terms of money returned to them, for me and for my colleagues in the charity sector, it is about the service users, the beneficiaries. And for me at Mary's Meals, that's about hungry and impoverished children in the developing world. So my experience of working in the corporate world versus coming now and working for Mary's Meals is that I don't think it gets any better than ending your day knowing that you've served a hungry child. Working in the charity sector is hugely challenging, especially when you're trying to grow an organisation to meet the type of problem that exists in the world with hunger and lack of access to education. So I definitely, I've noticed, by the way, that when people from the corporate world come and interview for roles at Mary's Meals, and maybe I was guilty of this, I have to say, when I was moving from being a journalist, there is a tendency to think maybe life will be slightly easier in the charity sector than the corporate world. I don't know, maybe because of that stereotype of maybe it's not as professional, less slick, less money around, whatever. My experience, just personally, is that it's much, much harder. You're much more driven to try and tackle a massive problem, and therefore the burden, I suppose, of wanting to do your absolute best every day, because the end user being the hungry child, it can be a heavy burden to hold, but it's also just a great privilege. So that's probably the only thing, the for-profit versus for the end user, because everything else I think depends very much on the specific organisation, as I say.
Thank you for that one. I know it's wondered by many people, kind of what is that difference? So thank you for answering that question. Our next question is very different, as we only have I think 4 more questions before we move on to the student Q&A. But our next question is thinking about global citizenship. So what is global citizenship and why is that important?
Yeah, global citizenship, I think, simply put, is really just about understanding the wider world, wanting to understand the wider world, and therefore having a better sense of your own place in it. Being a global citizen, I think, is about recognising that things don't just end at the borders of your own nation. And for me, being a good global citizen is about being focused on people and planet everywhere. So we all share this common home, the Earth, and environmentally it's under greater stress than ever. And so wanting to work together globally on that particular issue around climate change and global warming is a good example of where you just can't say we're going to do one thing here in the UK versus elsewhere. We share that problem. And that's just one example. My line of work in terms of distribution of food equitably and fairly so that children are able to eat and to be able to go to school. That's another amazing commodity, education that needs to be equitable across the world. Being a global citizen is about saying, I want to be part of making the world fairer for everybody. Everybody will have the same access to good things and to opportunity. So yeah, I think that's probably my definition of it.
And then as a follow-up question then, how could our students watching kind of get involved and make sure that they are contributing to the idea of global citizenship in a positive way?
Yeah, well, you might have heard the phrase charity begins at home. Sometimes people like to say that in a way that suggests that therefore it should end there. So my phrase is charity begins at home, but it shouldn't end there. Because I think it is important that we work in our local communities with people who are close to us physically, in close proximity, to assist our neighbours and our brothers and sisters just wherever we live in the world. But we must find a way to reach out beyond that too, especially to places where the degree of hardship is much worse, because in the world's poorest country, the social countries, the social safety nets that sometimes exist here in the UK to support people through the welfare state and what the government provides and what charities provide just isn't available in the world's poorest places. So do what you can to support people here, but also look to organisations globally that you can help to support people in other places as well. It's funny whenever I talk about charity beginning at home and all of that, I'm reminded of our founder, Magnus, Mary's Meals founder, talks about a particular volunteer cook he met in Malawi once, and he asked her, why is it that she does the job of volunteering to cook the food every day? And that's quite a common question. I've asked it a million times to cooks that I've met when I've been out and about in our programme's countries over the years. And quite often, they'll just talk about the fact that they believe that their children, need food and need to be in education. And so they want to work with Mary's Meals to make that happen. But this volunteer that Magnus, our founder, was speaking to this day, just replied really simply, we do it because we have it in our hearts. We do it because we have it in our hearts. And I think just in terms of trying to encourage young people here to be global citizens, just try to find it in your heart. I often say to my team when we're worried about people who are critical of Mary's Meals or saying that they won't get involved because there's too much poverty here in the UK, I tend to say, oh, maybe they just don't have it in their hearts. They're not the people we need to appeal to right now. So being a good global citizen is about trying to create an environment in which your heart is there for this type of work. In terms of kind of more practical things, certainly you can get involved in the work of Mary's Meals. Our website is marysmeals.org.uk. We have a particular youth volunteer role that you can sign up for, and that helps contribute towards this feeding of 2.5 million children every single day. But there's lots of other kind of charities that you can get involved with internationally that have different initiatives that help you to be a good global citizen. Also, I think to this point about charity beginning at home but not ending there, be a good local citizen, volunteer at a local food bank, get involved in a local church's initiative or something your school's doing, or a local Rotary club or Scout group or whatever exists in your local community, which is doing some good. And then beyond getting involved in organisations, depends what age you're at now, but travel, find ways to get out of your immediate comfort zone and experience cultures in other places. As you're growing up, I think it's important to get out there and to see how things work in different countries. And if you're not being able to physically travel as much as you would like, or maybe you're at an age where it's not quite possible or money doesn't quite allow you to do it yet, then do the next best thing. Read about other cultures, get invested in books about other places, learn another language. These are all things you can do to just make sure you're more connected and you understand things beyond your own country. So yeah, hopefully there's some ideas in there that people would like to kind of look at.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And we have also shared the link to Mary's Meals website in the chat. So just pop to the Q&A feed if you do want to check that out. We've got 2 questions left before we move on to our student Q&A. So our next question is, how do you avoid being complacent in your role? And you did touch on this at the start of your last question, but any kind of further things you'd like to add?
It's really difficult to be complacent when your mission is so centered on something so important and meaningful every day. So that helps. At the same time, I really need to, and I encourage my team always to recenter themselves on the communities we serve every day, to think about the hungry child, to think about the problems that exist in the developing world. So you need to renew that every day. I think it's important that whatever job you do, whether it's in the charity sector or not, that you make a daily choice to keep doing it. Don't get into the rut of thinking that this is just my job. I just get up every day and I do this thing. It's a choice every day, and you can choose something different. You can choose to apply for another job. You can choose to take time away. You can make a different choice. So I do that every day. I try to reflect on the choice I'm making to keep doing it. Also, I think for me, especially as somebody who's the chief executive of Mary's Meals UK, you need to make sure that you've got good people round about you, folk who can challenge you. It doesn't matter how kind of high up you get or what particular role you're playing in an organisation. It's really important that you try to surround yourself with people who will give you feedback, who will constructively criticise the way you're going about your work. I think if you stop hearing other people saying certain things to you that are more negative rather than just saying that you're great all the time, then that is when you should start to worry. And for me, being a leader, that is about directly asking people and saying, what can I do better? Is there anything in this space that, you know, I'm not so good at or I'm losing sight of? So yeah, I think definitely that's important. And just maybe the last thing, this is a bit like the kind of making that daily choice thing, but stopping and reflecting and taking time to reflect. I happen to be somebody who's motivated by my own Catholic faith, so I happen to pray, and that's part of my sort of daily meditation. But whether you're somebody of faith or not, time spent quietly reflecting and thinking deeply about your day-to-day work rather than just allowing the noise of the world to kind of continually carry you along. And I should say I'm really bad at that. That's not my personality, but I've realized through the years that actually if you don't do that, you will just keep coasting, but you're not taking a breath to think about what really matters. And I found that really helps me to avoid complacency.
Great, thank you. Such a brilliant answer, and a great little bit of advice in there as well, which is nice to get. So our final question before we move on to our student Q&A is always a really lovely one to finish on, which is, what piece of advice would you give to your 16-year-old self?
Well, I'll finish where I began, maybe, in terms of this, because the key thing that I wish I could tell my 16-year-old self is that I'm enough. You know, I deserve to be anywhere as much as anybody else. That's what I felt when I went to university, that I was kind of in the wrong place, that I was kind of an imposter, that my particular background meant that, yeah, I was less clever or less well suited to that particular environment. Through my career being a journalist and now these 12 years working for Mary's Meals, my my reflection is that most people in life are just trying to do their best, and everybody feels a sense of, I'm a bit of an imposter at times. You've heard the phrase "fake it till you make it," maybe. I really advise that, and I would advise my 16-year-old that as well. Everybody's doing a bit of that. I think adults tend to project onto young people that everybody kind of knows what they're doing when they become an adult. I think that's a really bad thing to tell people, that you kind of just know all the answers. You're just constantly living through a new childhood in a way, exploring different things and not quite knowing what to do. But you're worthy of it. You deserve to be there. You should be valued. And you know, in my career, I've met Pope Francis. I've been in the room with princesses and really key business people, and my younger self, my 16-year-old self, would think that I was unworthy of that. And having experienced it all, the key message to young people that I meet is just believe in yourself. Don't get bogged down in the idea that you don't belong anywhere, because you absolutely are, whatever background you come from. If you apply yourself, if you're serious about the things that you care about and that you work hard, then you absolutely deserve to be in the room alongside anybody else.
Thank you so much for answering that final question as part of our formal Q&A. For the final 10 minutes, we're going to move on to our student Q&A, and we've had several questions that have been submitted for you to answer. So our first question is really simple, and it might be quite complicated to answer. It's, what does your day-to-day look like?
Yeah, my day-to-day, well, I lead a team of about 70 people in Mary's Meals UK. So that's 70 staff members, but beyond that, there's about 800 volunteers for Mary's Meals within the UK. It's many more than that globally. In Malawi alone, we've got something like 65,000 volunteer cooks every day. So it's massive globally. But in the UK, 800 volunteers and 70 staff members. So a huge amount of my day-to-day is about just liaising with different members of that team, especially my immediate senior management team, to make sure that the Mary's Meals organisation is functioning well. And I just kind of make choices every day about the part of the organisation that maybe needs my support and needs my direction a little bit more. It's a great joy, that it's really about trusting the people around me to go about and be expert in their particular jobs, but just trying to inspire them, bring them back to the core of the Mary's Meals mission, make sure that everything is being done in line with our values. We're really kind of focused on the fact that the ends don't justify the means. So, you know, if we were to raise £50 million today through nefarious activities, something that was bad, then it wouldn't justify the fact that we'd raised that money and we were able to feed lots of children as a result. So really, I can trust my team on this, absolutely. But my job is to make sure, to guarantee that we're actually going about our work in alignment with our values in the right way. Beyond that, a huge amount of my work is really about liaising with different supporters of Mary's Meals. So that might be governments, the UK government, Scottish government support the work of Mary's Meals. It might be trusts or foundations. It might be wealthy individuals. But for the most part, actually different grassroots supporters of Mary's Meals. More than anything, Mary's Meals is funded by lots of people giving small amounts of money. folk who are just normal people, and they're supporting us by giving us usually close to that £19.15 figure that I said fed a child for a year. And that's the great joy of my work, is just being able to connect with people who are supporting us on that basis. Yeah, that's probably most of what my day-to-day looks like. There are differences daily, but that's a lot of what it is.
We have a great question that leads really well from that last point you made. So one of the questions is it scary to work for a company that relies on donations from the public?
I wouldn't say it's scary. I wouldn't say scary, because our experience with Mary's Meals, as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about believing in the innate goodness of people, is that when you tell the story of our particular organisation and you share the difficulties experienced by the world's poorest children, people respond. People respond. Now, does that mean that there aren't difficult moments? No, it doesn't. There are definitely challenges. And this last year, we've seen this huge cost of living challenge. People are struggling to pay their own bills. So in that sort of environment, being able to go that bit further and feed hungry children in the developing world can be a challenge. And then last year, when the Ukraine war began, a huge amount of the world's attention, and especially charitable giving, quite rightly moved towards supporting Ukrainian people. And that meant for Mary's Meals that maybe there was less emphasis on children living in sub-Saharan Africa. There was maybe an element of children being a bit forgotten amidst that. So our job is to, at Mary's Meals, just keep reminding people of that, tell the story. And as I say, through all of these years, the reason we've gone from feeding 200 children to 2.5 million children today is because of just huge growth in the number of people giving to our mission, therefore the amount of pounds and pence coming into us, and therefore the number of kids that we're actually able to reach. So scary is not the word. Maybe the last thing to say is that this maybe is related to my personal kind of faith-based view of the world, but it's important to recognise that this just doesn't all depend on us. If I was to think every day that this was all about me, that if I didn't do certain things, it's important I do my job diligently and well, but at a certain point, kind of the universe, if you want to look at it that way, in my case, divine providence looks after it, that you can just kind of trust that people will respond when they hear the challenges that the world's poorest children face. And the practical reality is that for Mary's Meals, that has been the case. We've been able to grow and prosper and reach more kids.
Great. So our next question that's coming is it true that roles in charities are at the lower end of the market in terms of pay?
Great question. I would say that the answer to that is broadly yes. However, a bit like the question earlier about the difference between the corporate and charity worlds, it depends on the organisation. There are some organisations in the charity sector who would benchmark salaries fairly well against corporate world, but I think broadly the charity sector is less well paid. It's a difficult thing, this, because when you're seeking to overcome one of the most intractable problems in the world, like, for example, world hunger, there's an argument to say, why wouldn't you pay people who are doing that every day the same as, or even more than, people who work for Microsoft or Apple or Amazon or any of these big companies where people might be tended to be paid more? But people will have different philosophies about it. I'll just tell you what mine is. I don't think people should get rich working for the world's poorest children. So I think it's quite right that while people should be paid fairly and justly, it's probably okay that, especially for senior roles like the job I'm doing, that you are not benchmarked against the wider market, because actually the public are donating these funds freely, so that we can reach as many children as possible. So trying to make sure we steward our funds as well as we can, so that people are paid justly and well, but actually not paid in a way that is outsized versus the need of the hungry child that you're trying to reach. certainly our philosophy at Mary's Meals is that we want our employees to be well looked after. I think you would hear that from Mary's Meals employees, that their well-being is prioritised and that we want to make sure that they're given a just wage. But at the same time, the reality is that you have to balance that against how do you reach more hungry children more quickly, especially when, as I said earlier, there are millions and millions of children waiting to be reached. So the basic answer is yes, I think that's broadly true, but it's not necessarily cut and dry. I think that it's a bad thing that that's the case. I think there are different kind of extremes. Maybe some charities are not benchmarking sufficiently well against the corporate world or other charities, but there's a kind of middle ground as well.
Yeah, there certainly is. As a charity, I think we do a great job at hitting that place. And you'll often find that people who work in charities are happy to get a less pay for the work that they do, and that's a sacrifice that they don't even feel is a sacrifice, because that's why they choose to be here.
I'm glad you used the word sacrifice, because I forgot to use it, and it's the right word for this, because I think there is an element of it's service vocation that comes from working in charity. As I say, it's a fine balancing act, because you need to be able to attract people to the charity sector as well. So yeah, but I think I would see in my personal case that a sacrifice has to be made, and I'm willing to make it for the type of work I do.
Yeah, brilliant. So our final question before we wrap up today's session is volunteering for a charity a good way to break into the sector?
I would say absolutely it is, yes. I know of lots of people who currently work for Mary's Meals who would have begun their service to the charity in a volunteer role. Obviously, lots of people get involved as volunteers and they never have any intention of seeking paid employment, and that's really important as well. That would be the majority of people. But for those people who would like to eventually work for the charity, to get involved in charity work as a volunteer and start to get to know the things which make the charity sector tick, I mean, it's a great apprenticeship. It's a great apprenticeship. And also there are some charities, Mary's Meals does this to a certain extent, but maybe not the biggest program at this stage, but they do that kind of middle ground for those people who want to eventually work, which is obviously an internship. So young people who would like to work for charities, I would definitely advocate volunteering, but also search online for internships that charities are running as well. They tend to be quite competitive though, internships. So if you don't get one of those which covers some degree of your expenses to be involved, then just show your love for the charity sector by doing it free of charge and just for the love of it initially, and then see where it leads. Because if it's the right place for you, then absolutely, I think you'll get a job and you'll be really happy.
Awesome. Thank you for answering all of our questions. Do you have any final thoughts that you would like to leave our young people with before we end today's session?
No, not really. Just to say thank you to anybody who's joining. It's been a privilege to do it. Thanks to you, Charlie, and to Jazz in the background and Speakers for Schools in general. I'm so positive about Speakers for Schools, just as a charitable entity in itself, and what it allows young people to access in terms of different speakers from different environments. So well done to Speakers for Schools for that. Maybe my final thought will just be to hark back to the words of that volunteer, Cook, who said that she does her work in the charity sector because she has it in her heart. Find it in your heart, everybody, to do some of this work as well, and be good global citizens.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for joining us. It's been such a wonderful broadcast and so insightful and so interesting. And I'm so glad to have learned so much about you as an individual and the work you do with Mary's Meals. It's been really wonderful to have you on. So thank you.
Thank you, Charlie.